Some historical mysteries will never be solved, since everyone who had any information on these cases has passed away, and now we only have limited knowledge as to what happened. Luckily, many questions from history are eventually answered when an obscure piece of information is unearthed and the mystery can finally be laid to rest. Number 10. Cryptozoologists are always looking for proof that mythical creatures such as the Loch Ness Monster or Chupacabra exist, usually without much luck. In some cases, people searching for proof of Bigfoot's existence have come across massive footprints in the woods, but were still unable to track the creature down. A similar case played out in Clearwater, Florida in 1948, when one of the city's residents stumbled across something truly bizarre, and it resulted in a mystery that lasted for a decade before the true cause was finally revealed. In February of that year, a man was walking along a beach in Clearwater when he noticed a footprint in the sand. But this was no ordinary footprint. When it was measured, it was found to be 11 inches in width and 14 inches long, which would not be abnormal for such a large creature. But the print had one other strange characteristic. The creature that left it in the sand only had 3 toes, one pointing to the front, with the 2 others stretching out to the side. Furthermore, the print showed that it had long claws, and biologists were left baffled, as were the city's residents. The creature left a trail of footprints, showing that it exited the water at the southern end of the beach, and then walked along the beach for 2 miles before returning to the water once more. Locals became concerned since no one had any idea of what type of animal it could be, and whether it was safe to swim in the water and spend time on the beach. One thing was certain though, it was a large animal, as was evidenced by the fact that each footprint was found about 6 feet from the last. Shortly after this incident, identical tracks were found at another Florida beach in Sarasota, and for the next 2 years, residents of the areas between these 2 cities would contact the authorities whenever a fresh set of prints was found. Soon enough, the creature earned its nickname of Old Threetoes, and as is usually the case with cryptids, many people started claiming that they had encountered it. One man described it as a large bird-like creature with a head akin to that of a dog. Strangely, the creature seemed to be able to stay out of the water for a long time, since tracks were also found at the Suwannee River, which lies about 40 miles from the nearest beach. Having heard about the strange case, a New York zoologist named Ivan Anderson traveled to Florida in hopes of finding the creature, and he started interviewing witnesses. He eventually concluded that the prints were made by an animal, since he believed no human or machine could make imprints as deep as those that were found. On one occasion, he revealed that he tracked Old Threetoes down and described it as about 12 feet in length with a strange yellow coloring. He added that it had flippers that helped it move through the water and that it used powerful hind legs to propel itself forward. Finally, he decided that it was some type of massive penguin, but he never managed to take a photo of it or prove that it really existed. For the next decade, the prints would show up from time to time, but none were ever seen after 1958. It seemed as though the creature had either perished or moved on. But in 1988, the truth would finally be revealed. Tony Signorini, a resident of Clearwater, admitted that he and a friend of his, Al Williams, had created a pair of massive cast iron feet which they used to make the imprints. These feet were attached to a pair of sneakers, and for 10 years they would sneak out in the dead of night to continue the hoax. Number 9. Most people who are interested in unsolved mysteries from around the world will be familiar with the baffling case of the Summerton Man. For the uninitiated, the mystery started on the 1st of December 1948 when 2 jockeys were riding their horses on Summerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia, early that morning. They came across a deceased man lying on the beach, and they immediately notified the police, who were surprised to find that all of the labels on his clothing had been removed. He had no identification on him, and he was lying in a peculiar position with his head against the sea wall and his legs crossed in front of him, as if he'd been sleeping. A half-smoked cigarette was found on his coat's right collar, and when he was searched, investigators found a second-class train ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, but it had never been used. He also had an aluminum comb that was manufactured in the US, a half-eaten packet of juicy fruit gum, an Army Club cigarette bag containing 7 cigarettes of a different brand, and a box of matches on him. Several people would report seeing the man lying in that same spot the night before, but it was believed that he was still alive at that point, since one couple saw him raise his arm before dropping it at his side again. They and the other witnesses who saw him that night believed he was inebriated, and so they didn't approach him. An autopsy revealed he was in excellent shape and that he'd likely been poisoned. In January of 1949, a suitcase was found at Adelaide Station. Its label had been removed, but it's believed to have been this man's possessions. Inside, the police found a dressing gown, a pair of slippers, men's underwear, pants with sand in the cuffs, a tie, a screwdriver, a sharpened blade, a pair of scissors, a stenciling brush, and items used for shaving. All the labels had been removed from the clothing except for the tie, which bore the name Keene. Later on, a piece of paper was found in the fob pocket of the man's pants, and it contained the text Tamam Shud, which translates to finished. The page was found to be the last page of a book by Omar Khayyam. The book from which the page was torn was eventually located, and it contained a phone number in the bag. The number belonged to Jessica Thompson, a nurse who lived close to Summerton Beach. She stated she didn't recognize the man, but seemed to be evasive when asked about him. But she did admit that she owned a copy of the book that she had gifted to a man named Alf Boxall. But it was found that Boxall was still alive, and so the mystery endured. For the next 73 years, the man remained unidentified until 2022, when Professor Derek Abbott from the University of Adelaide and genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick started an investigation. They managed to obtain samples of the man's hair that were sent for DNA analysis. They then constructed a family tree based on the results, and finally, the Summerton Man was identified as an electrical engineer named Charles Webb. It's believed he traveled from his hometown of Melbourne to Adelaide to find his ex-wife, but lost his life in the process. Number 8. For a very long time, when archaeologists found artifacts, texts, and hieroglyphics in ancient Egyptian tombs and structures, they had no way of knowing what these symbols meant. The best they could do was guess at what the ancient people were trying to portray, but this method was very unreliable. Then, in July of 1979, a group of French soldiers that was stationed in Egypt were conducting work on the foundation of a fort close to the town of Rosetta, when Lieutenant Pierre-François Boucard made a remarkable discovery. He came upon a stone covered in strange writing, which was later revealed to be hieroglyphic, Demotic in Greek. It became known as the Rosetta Stone, and it was believed that it held the key to deciphering many of the hieroglyphs and other texts that had been found. But no one knew how this would be done. The black stone, believed to be part of a much bigger stone, was shipped to the Society of Antiquaries in London, where copies were made. These were then sent to universities all over the world in hopes that someone would be able to decode them. A well-known student of languages, Jean-François Champollion, did his best to solve the mystery of the stone, but for 23 years he made no real progress whatsoever. Then, in 1822, he had a massive breakthrough that caused him so much excitement that he fainted. He'd cracked the code after realizing that the hieroglyphs were to be read as sounds rather than phonetics, and that these phonetics were part of a central script that could be used to identify names found on artifacts and in tombs in Egypt. Hence, the symbols were meant to be read as a book rather than as a spoken language, and one sound could be represented by many different symbols. Using the stone, hundreds of scripts that had been found over the centuries could be correctly translated, and the world got a completely new perspective of Egyptian history. Today, it's believed that the stone was created by the Ptolemaic regime in an effort to ensure that people living in the area at that time, who spoke different languages, would be able to read and understand the texts and symbols that were left behind. In 394, the last hieroglyphs were added to the Temple of Isis by a scholar and scribe called Smet. It's believed that he was one of very few individuals left who could read hieroglyphs, and by the 5th century, that knowledge had been lost. For centuries, scripts and symbols were unearthed in Egypt, but no one had any idea what they meant since there was no way of definitively reading them correctly. That is, until the stone was finally uncovered, and the scholars then started to decode these texts, rewriting history forever. Number 7. During the early 1900s, many explorers left their homelands in an effort to find places on our planet that had never been seen before. Many of these expeditions ended in failure or tragedy when they ran out of supplies or succumbed to the elements, which comes as no surprise since they often ventured into the unknown with no idea of what to expect. One of these explorers was a man named Robert Edwin Peary. In 1909, he was living in Pennsylvania, but had served in the Navy and become the first man, along with Matthew Henson and 3 Inuit men, to reach the North Pole. Peary's assistant, a man named Donald McMillan, failed to reach the pole after he had to turn back due to a bad case of frozen heels. Once at the pole, the remaining men spent about 30 hours in the area, just long enough to take some notes and plant an American flag before starting their 3-week journey home aboard the SS Roosevelt. The expedition left the pole from Ellesmere and then became trapped in the ice, but it eventually broke free, and when Peary returned to the US, he was welcomed as a hero. He was promoted to admiral. But soon after making the discovery, an explorer called Frederick Cook claimed he'd found the pole a year earlier in 1908, but Peary pointed out that the route which Cook claimed to have taken to the pole would have led him through an island covered in ice, which Peary had discovered in 1906. He named that island Crockerland, despite never setting foot on land there. This led to a lot of speculation, and to put the matter to rest once and for all, McMillan decided to launch an expedition to Crockerland in 1913. He and his crew set sail for the island in July of 1913. Following Peary's directions and notes, they expected to find many strange and unimaginable creatures on the island, and it was suggested that an unknown race of people could also be living there. Peary supported the expedition, but 2 weeks into the journey, McMillan's ship ran aground on the Labrador coast, and the blame was placed on the captain, who was known to be drinking whiskey in only his underwear the night before. They eventually boarded a replacement ship and traveled to Etah in Greenland, from where they continued on foot, but they'd returned to Etah when several men fell ill. The expedition continued in 1914, and at one point they believed they'd found Crockerland, but it turned out to be a mirage. They were forced to turn back without ever reaching their intended destination, and eventually returned to the US. It's now known that Peary had lied about finding Crockerland, and only claimed to have done so to discredit Cook, and to appeal to the vanity of George Crocker in an effort to secure more funding. It's also now believed that Cook also lied about reaching the North Pole, since his records of his expedition were found to be filled with inconsistencies and obvious fabrications. Number 6. The Odyssey is an epic poem written by the ancient Greek poet Homer, sometime between 750 and 650 BC. The tale concerns the king of Ithaca, Odysseus, who's just finished fighting in the Trojan War, and who's trying to make his way home. But what should have been a relatively short journey ends up taking 10 years, as he encounters several different trials along the way. These are the result of divine punishment, and he and his crew are forced to face off against a slew of mythical creatures. Back in Ithaca, Odysseus' wife, Penelope, has to deal with suitors who try to take her hand in marriage in an effort to become the new king. But the tale has a happy ending as Odysseus returns home and reclaims his throne after defeating his rivals. The Odyssey is still considered today to be one of the greatest works of fiction ever created, and it's been made into several movies over the years. But it's also at the center of a very strange mystery that kept historians baffled for nearly a decade. This is known as a mystery marginalia, which is often found in very old texts. It occurs when small pieces of writing are found in the margins of historic texts without any context, and historians have the unenviable task of figuring out what they mean and who they were written by. The mystery marginalia concerning the Odyssey began in 2007, when a man named M.C. Lang donated his collection of Homer's works to the University of Chicago's library. One book in the collection dates back to 1504, and when it was studied more closely, it was found to contain handwritten script in the margins that no one could read. Lang suspected that it might be a form of 19th century French shorthand, but he had no way of proving it. But he did recognize a few French words among the scribbles, and historians estimated that the script dated back to the 19th century. After failing to make any headway, the library decided to offer a $1,000 reward to anyone who could decipher the script, and several linguists tried their hand at solving the mystery to no avail. In order to claim the prize money and the honor of solving the riddle, the script had to be identified. Proof that the writing had been deciphered had to be provided, and certain sections of the writing had to be correctly translated. For weeks, people from all over the world started submitting their suggestions, but none managed to solve the perplexing mystery. But then, a man named Daniel Matili, a computer engineer with a love for decoding ciphers, submitted his effort, and it was found to be correct. He and Julia Aceta, a French stenographer, started by looking at French shorthand systems that were used in the 19th century, but they came short. They then came across an 18th century form of stenography, and they finally started to make some headway. Soon, they translated the script on 2 of the book's pages, and they were found to be French translations of Greek words, as well as notes about the tale, comparisons of definitions, and errors that had been corrected by the author of these notes. The mystery was finally solved, but one question still remains. No one knows who added these notes to the book and why they chose to write them in an incredibly rare and valuable copy of Homer's Odyssey that dates back centuries. Number 5. On the 29th of November, 1993, investigators from the Clearwater Police Department in Florida were perplexed when they were notified that a deceased man had been found near the east side of a bridge close to Sand Key. When they arrived at the scene, the man was removed from the water, but none of the police officers recognized him. The mystery only deepened when they found the man's clothes: a pair of boxers, blue slippers, a yellow Pulsar watch, a pair of jeans, a white shirt, a white long-sleeve shirt, and a blue sweatshirt neatly folded near the lifeguard station on Clearwater Beach, but they contained no form of identification. When an autopsy was performed, the manner of the man's passing could not be determined, but the coroner did state that they didn't suspect any type of foul play. It was revealed that the man was between 60 and 80 years old, standing 5 foot 4 inches tall, and that he weighed 118 pounds. He had blue eyes and short gray hair. For the next 300 years, no one had any idea who the man was or how he ended up in the water that day. Furthermore, no one came forward to identify him, and no one matching his description was reported as missing. DNA samples were collected, and 30 years later, they were sent to Moxie Forensic Investigations, a nonprofit agency that works with several branches of law enforcement by providing them with genetic genealogy services. Soon after the samples were provided, matches were found for someone who either lived in England or who had recently immigrated there. This struck investigators as strange, since the man was found in Pinellas County. The man had English ancestors dating back to the 16th century, and once they believed they had identified the man, they made sure of their findings by contacting his next of kin. A man believed to be the John Doe's son was tracked down, and his DNA was collected. This was also sent for testing, and the results were compared to those of the deceased man. It was quickly determined that they were closely related, and that the deceased man was the second man's father. Once this was definitively proven, investigators felt confident in revealing that the man found on the beach that day was Edmund Gleed. His son, who by this time was 94 years old, was living in North Carolina, and he was surprised to finally find out what happened to his father all those years ago. Number 4. The town of West Springfield in Massachusetts became the site of a strange mystery in November of 1987, when 2 people were found deceased, clearly the victims of an attack, and for 40 years the culprit remained unidentified. It all started on the 19th of November that year, when a patrolman named Earl Camp was performing his duties along Route 5 in West Springfield. As he drove past a rest stop on that route, he happened to look over to the parking lot area, and something strange caught his eye. When he drove past the lot earlier that morning, he noticed an old pickup truck, which was not in the best condition, in one of the parking bays. It was now 9:30 a.m., and he was surprised to find it still parked there. But what grabbed his attention this time around was the fact that one of the windows was broken. He stopped his patrol car and approached the truck, but he stopped in his tracks when he noticed a pool of what looked like biological material beneath it. He then realized that the trail of liquid led toward the edge of the lot. He edged forward and managed to take a quick look inside the vehicle, but found it to be empty. But it was covered in biological material, and he knew something sinister had happened here. He decided to follow the trail of liquid and found more of the material on a handrail and more leading down to a retaining wall. There, he came across the bodies of two people who were later identified as 20-year-old Mark Harnish and 18-year-old Teresa Marcoux. They'd been attacked with a firearm, and their bodies were left about 2 feet apart. An investigation revealed that Mark worked as a mechanic at Shaker Foreign Car Repair, and that Teresa was employed at Brightwood Hardware, specifically in the pet section. They both came from Long Meadow, and Teresa had moved out of her family's house a year earlier. She and Mark were living in the truck that was found in the parking lot, and whenever they were unable to find a place to sleep, they would find a spot, such as a parking lot, to spend the night. It was suggested that the pair was attacked in the truck, and their assailant then dragged their bodies over the handrail to the spot where they were discovered. It was also revealed that this particular parking spot was popular with couples, and the police usually chased anyone who was loitering there away. But according to people living in the area, they would usually leave them be after 10 p.m. Mark and Teresa had attended a party that night and left at around 12:30 a.m. One witness would report hearing several rounds being fired at around 4 a.m., but decided not to investigate. None of the couple's friends could think of anyone with a motive to harm them, since they were both well-liked and stayed out of trouble as best they could. But there was one piece of evidence. A latent print was found on the passenger side vent window, and it didn't match either of the victims. It was compared to over 70,000 prints in the database, but no match was found. For 40 years, the case remained cold, but in 2000, investigators got a break in the case. A man named Timothy Jolie applied for a taxicab license, and in doing so provided his fingerprints. These prints and Jolie's details were handed to the Springfield Police Department, and they were found to be a match for the crime scene, and the case started to unfold. It was discovered that he'd bought a firearm about a month before the incident in 1978. After his arrest, he pleaded guilty to the charges against him, and he's currently awaiting trial. Number 3. On the 4th of July, 1983, 27-year-old Teresa Peroni was attending a party in Selma, Oregon with her boyfriend, 29-year-old Mark Sanfratello. The night out started well, but at some point, the couple got into an argument when Teresa accused Mark of having an affair with another woman. Witnesses would later tell the police that they were last seen walking into a wooded area at 1270 Illinois River Road, still engaged in the argument. Teresa was never seen again, and her family reported her as missing when she didn't come home. After hearing the details of that night, investigators labeled Teresa's disappearance as suspicious, but no evidence was found that she'd been harmed, and hence no charges could be filed against anyone. Searches of the area were conducted, but no further clues were found. Teresa simply remained missing, and before long her case went cold. It remained this way until 14 years later in 1997, when someone found a skull on a piece of land close to the wooded area where Teresa was last seen. A sniffer dog was used to look for further remains, but none were found. The skull was sent to the University of North Texas for DNA testing, and the case was reopened after it was confirmed to belong to Teresa. Investigators appealed to anyone who had information on the case to come forward, so that the mystery could finally be solved, and so that the person responsible for her passing could be brought to justice. But no further witnesses ever contacted the police. But since Sanfratello was last seen walking into the woods with Teresa, it was suspected he was responsible for ending her life, and he was taken into custody on the 28th of June 2025, 42 years after Teresa went missing. While the police now had a suspect, the exact events of that night remain unknown. Many people suspected that the couple walked into the woods so that they wouldn't cause a scene at the party while arguing, and at some point the fight became physical, leading to San Fratello ending Teresa's life. It's since been revealed that San Fratello was considered a suspect at the time of the incident, but there was no probable cause to charge him with the crime, since Teresa's body was never found. For the next 4 decades, he remained a free man, while his victim's family spent years agonizing over her fate. The police also stated during the course of their investigation that they tracked down several people who were at the party that night and who were still alive, but they were all ruled out as suspects. Teresa's brother has since stated that the couple's relationship was a volatile one that often resulted in arguments. This started after she joined a church and started turning her life around. It was also later revealed that San Fratello had a history with the law. 2 years after Teresa's disappearance, he was sent to prison for 15 years after attacking his ex-wife with a sharpened blade. He's also been convicted of embezzlement. San Fratello was extradited to Oregon, where he'll now stand trial at the age of 72. Number 2. The mystery surrounding the murder of 35-year-old Jeanie Childs started on the 13th of June, 1993. At around 5:30 p.m. that day, a resident from a high-rise apartment building in Minneapolis was surprised to find water flowing into their apartment from an unknown source, and they contacted the building's caretaker. He arrived in the company of a security guard and traced the leak back to apartment number 2104. They knocked on the door but got no answer, so the caretaker used his key to enter the apartment. He and the guard found that the shower had been left running, and that this was causing the water to leak into the next-door apartment. Once the water was turned off, they decided to search the rest of the apartment to notify the tenant, Jeanie Childs, that she'd left her shower running. But they could never have expected what they found next. In the bedroom, they discovered Jeanie deceased. She was lying partially under her bed, and they noticed several areas that contained biological material. The pair immediately left the room and contacted the police, who quickly determined that she'd been attacked in front of the bathroom door. She somehow managed to make her way into her bedroom, where her attacker caught up with her, and then ended her life with the use of a sharpened blade. The apartment was searched, and strangely, the kitchen sink was still running. It was suggested that the attacker was in the process of cleaning up when he was interrupted, but this remained just a theory. It was believed that Jeanie fought back against her attacker, who it was theorized was familiar with her, since no signs of forced entry were found. Thanks to the state of the crime scene, it was believed that the culprit got upset about something and then carried out the attack. Jeannie's mother later told investigators that she'd been to the emergency room that weekend, as she was having trouble with her teeth and was in a lot of pain. Her mother offered to pick her up, but she declined and told her not to worry too much. The weapon that was used in the attack wasn't recovered, but DNA samples were collected and sent for testing. One piece of evidence was found, though. Investigators noticed a bare footprint in the biological material under the bedroom window, and since Jeanie was wearing socks, it had to belong to her attacker. It was discovered she was dating a man named Arthur Gray, who lived in the apartment complex, and he was immediately considered a suspect. According to witnesses, Jeanie had been working for Gray as a street worker, and they would often have violent arguments. But Gray claimed he was out of town on a motorbike trip when the crime was committed, and several witnesses confirmed this. The print found at the scene was compared to Gray's feet, and they weren't a match, so he was ruled out. Another tenant told police that they saw Jeanie in the company of a tall blonde man in a trench coat earlier that day, but he was never identified. For the next 2 decades, nothing more was found, but in 2015, the case was reopened. A DNA match was found for a man named John S. Wayne, but he denied having any knowledge of the attack. He stated that he was in the apartment building 2 years before the attack and could only speculate that he must have fallen at some point, which is why his DNA was found in Jeannie's apartment. He was ruled out when he was found to not be a match for the footprint found in Jeannie's room. DNA found in the room was sent to a genetic genealogy company, and 2 brothers living in Minnesota were found to be matches, one of whom was 52-year-old Jerry Westrom. He was followed to one of his daughter's hockey games, and there, investigators collected his DNA from a napkin that he used while eating his lunch. The DNA came back as a direct match to Jeannie's attacker, and Westrom was arrested. Furthermore, the footprint found at the scene was matched to Westrom, and it was now certain that he was present when Jeanie was attacked. He was charged with murder, found guilty, and handed a life sentence in prison. He'll be eligible for parole after serving 30 years. Number 1. It must come as quite a shock to a criminal when they're finally arrested for their crimes decades after the fact. This is exactly what happened to a man who ended the life of 31-year-old Catherine Donahue in 1979. In March of that year, Catherine was employed as a secretary in Glenarden, Maryland. On the 2nd of March that year, she and a few of her co-workers decided to go out for dinner in Georgetown after they finished their shifts, but they were the last people to see her alive. The next morning, a member of the public contacted the police to report that they'd found the body of a woman in a parking lot in the 8400 block of Hamlin Street in Glenarden, and they rushed to the scene. It was found that Catherine had been badly assaulted and then left in the parking lot by her attacker. No witnesses came forward with any information, and despite several appeals to the public, no further clues were found. Catherine's case quickly went cold since no suspects were ever identified, and for decades, no progress was made. Catherine's family was left devastated after being notified that her life had been ended, and they always held out hope that her attacker would be identified one day, despite the lack of evidence. At the time, DNA was collected from the scene, but in 1979, DNA profiling did not exist yet. But the DNA was kept as evidence for decades, and in 2024, the decision was made to take another look at Catherine's case. The collected DNA was sent for testing to the Othram Forensic Lab, and after extracting a usable sample, a genetic profile was created. This profile was sent to the FBI's Genetic Genealogy Department, and several people who were relatives of the attacker were identified. This eventually led to an 81-year-old man named Roger Zodas Brown, and he was named as a person of interest. Though the specifics have not been made public, investigators managed to obtain a sample of Brown's DNA, and when it was compared to that found at the crime scene, it was found to be a match. Brown was tracked down to his house in Pinehurst, North Carolina, where he was taken into custody. It was then discovered that he lived in Glenarden at the time of the attack, but he was never questioned since he wasn't considered a suspect. Brown was charged with murder, and investigators have stated that they're looking into several other unsolved crimes from the area at the time to determine whether he was responsible. Brown had only been out of prison for a year when he attacked Catherine, after serving 11 years for armed robbery, a crime he committed in New York in 1967. He's currently awaiting trial in Moore County. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.